Hey everyone, welcome back to True Stories with Mark. I'm Mark, and if you're new here, this is the place where we dive into real stories, real people, and the moments that changed everything. Some of these stories will surprise you. Some will break your heart. Some will make you question everything you thought you knew about the people around you. Is stranger than anything you could make up. Before we get into today's story, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next one. All right, let's get into it.
Newport smelled like salt and diesel in the morning, and Michael Reynolds had always loved that about it. He stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, watching the fog roll off the harbor 2 streets down, and he thought, not for the first time, that this was the only town he'd ever wanted to raise a family in. It was quiet. It was honest. It was the kind of place where the mailman knew your name, and the diner on Thames Street still gave kids free pie on their birthdays. He heard the small, uneven footsteps before he saw them. A 5-year-old stumbling half-run down the hallway, favoring nothing in particular, just moving the way children move when the world hasn't taught them caution yet. Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway in dinosaur pajamas, hair sticking up on one side, and climbed onto a chair at the table like it was a mountain to be conquered. "Daddy, is today a boat day?" Michael crouched down so he was eye level with his son. "Not today, bud. Today's a home day. I don't leave for another 2 weeks." Ethan's face did the thing it always did when he was thinking hard, eyebrows pulled together, lower lip pushed out. "Good," he said. "I don't like boat days." "I know you don't," Michael ruffled his hair. "But boat days are how Daddy buys you dinosaurs. And keeps the lights on. And feeds that bottomless pit you call a stomach." Ethan giggled, but the sound caught halfway, turned into a small cough that didn't quite finish, and for half a second his lips went the pale grayish color that Michael had learned, over 5 years, to watch for the way other fathers watched for skinned knees. It passed. Ethan reached for his cereal like nothing had happened. Michael's hand, resting on the back of the chair, had gone white-knuckled without him noticing. Sarah came in a moment later, already dressed for work, clipping an earring into place with the practiced speed of a woman who had learned to get an entire morning done in 20 minutes. She kissed the top of Ethan's head, then Michael's cheek, quick and habitual. "Doctor Guyon's office called yesterday while you were in the shower," she said, pulling a travel mug down from the cabinet. "They want to move the appointment up, Thursday instead of next month." Michael felt the floor tilt slightly under him, the way it always did at news like this. "Did they say why?" "They didn't say it like it was an emergency," Sarah said, too quickly, the way people say things they're trying to convince themselves of. "Just that the echo results were interesting and they wanted a closer look." Interesting was not a word cardiologists used lightly, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said it out loud, because Ethan was 6 feet away methodically drowning his cereal in more milk than any bowl could reasonably hold. And there were things you didn't say within earshot of a 5-year-old, even a 5-year-old who understood more than anyone gave him credit for. Thursday came, gray and drizzling, the kind of Rhode Island morning that couldn't decide if it wanted to be spring or winter. Dr. Patricia Nguyen's office was warm and yellow-walled, decorated with hand-drawn fish and smiling suns that some previous patient had made, presumably to convince other frightened children that this place wasn't as bad as it smelled. Ethan sat on the exam table in a paper gown, swinging his legs, unbothered, while Michael and Sarah sat in the 2 chairs against the wall holding hands without quite realizing they were doing it. Dr. Nguyen came in with the echocardiogram images already pulled up on her tablet, and something in the set of her shoulders told Michael everything before she said a word. "His right ventricle is working harder than it should be," she said, turning the screen so they could see the grainy black and white loop of their son's heart beating, valves opening and closing like a door that didn't quite fit its frame. "The defect we've been monitoring since he was 2. It's progressed. What we're seeing now is early-stage heart failure. Not in the way that sounds. He's not in danger this week, this month. But this is a heart that's compensating, and it won't be able to compensate forever." "What does that mean for us?" Sarah asked, her voice very steady, the voice of someone holding a great deal very carefully. "What does that mean we do?" "It means surgery," Dr. Nguyen said. "Not exploratory, not maybe. A full repair. We're looking at reconstructing the valve and closing the septal defect properly this time, not just patching what we patched when he was 2. This is a specialized procedure. There's a surgical team at Boston Children's that does exactly this kind of repair, and I'd want them doing it, not the team here." "When?" Michael asked. "Within the next 6 months, ideally. Sooner is better than later, but we have some room." "And the cost," Sarah said. And it was the question none of them wanted to ask in a room with hand-drawn fish on the walls, but it was the question that would define the next year of their lives, and everyone in that room knew it. Dr. Nguyen's face did something complicated, sympathy layered over the practiced neutrality of someone who delivered this particular piece of news often enough to have a system for it. "Insurance will cover a portion, not all of it." Depending on complications, depending on length of stay, you're likely looking at somewhere between $60,000 and $90,000 out of pocket, even with your coverage. Michael heard the number land in the room like something physical, something with weight and edges. $60,000 to $90,000. He did the math automatically, the way he did math on everything now. His salary as a marine engineer. Decent but not extraordinary. Sarah's salary at the insurance firm. Their mortgage, their car payment. The $4,000 they'd managed to save in the account they optimistically called Ethan's fund, which had been meant for college and was about to become something else entirely. In the car afterward, Ethan asleep in his booster seat with a lollipop the nurse had given him still clutched in one fist, Sarah stared out the window at the rain and said, very quietly, "We don't have it, Michael. We don't have anywhere close to that." "I know," Michael said. "So what do we do?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, watching the wipers cut back and forth across the windshield, watching Newport's gray streets slide past. He was thinking about a conversation he'd had 3 weeks earlier with Tom Alvarez, over beers at the Anchor, about a contract position on a container ship running the Pacific route, 6 sailings a year instead of 4, hazard pay, a completion bonus that alone would cover a third of what Dr. Guyon had just quoted them. He hadn't mentioned it to Sarah because he hadn't wanted to think about it, hadn't wanted to do the arithmetic that made it necessary. He did the arithmetic now. "I'm going to call Tom," he said. "There's a position, it pays more, a lot more, but it means longer runs." "How much longer?" "3 months at a time," Michael said. "Maybe 4 sailings a year instead of what I've been doing." Sarah didn't say anything for a long time. In the back seat, Ethan stirred, mumbled something about dinosaurs, and settled again. Finally she said, "Okay," in a voice that didn't sound okay at all, but sounded like a woman doing arithmetic of her own. The arithmetic of what a person gives up, and what a person is willing to give up, when the alternative is watching your child's heart slowly lose a fight nobody chose for him. "Okay," she said again, and reached over and took his hand, and neither of them knew yet, could not have known yet, everything that single word was going to cost them both. Chapter 2, Departure. The Ocean Voyager was a container ship the size of a small city block, and it left from the port of Providence on a Tuesday morning in March, low gray clouds pressing down on the water like a lid on a pot. Michael stood at the rail of the crew deck with his duffel bag at his feet, looking down at Sarah and Ethan on the dock below, and felt the particular ache that came with every departure, sharper this time because he knew this one wouldn't be 3 months. It would be closer to 4, and there would be another after it, and another after that, for as long as it took. Ethan had a sign he'd made with Sarah's help, block letters in marker that read "Be on voyage, Daddy," with a crayon drawing of what was either a whale or an extremely large fish underneath it. He held it over his head, jumping to make it visible, and Michael waved until his arm ached, until the tugboats had pulled the Voyager out past the breakwater and Newport's low skyline had shrunk to a smudge on the horizon, and then to nothing at all. Tom Alvarez found him there an hour later, still at the rail, and didn't say anything for a while, just leaned against it beside him, because Tom had done this enough times himself, 2 divorces behind him. He liked to joke, though nobody who knew him well thought it was really a joke, to know that the first hour out was not a time for talking. "Kid's gonna be fine," Tom said eventually. "Guyon's one of the best in New England, you said so yourself." "I know, and your wife's tougher than she looks. She'll hold it down." "I know that too," Michael said, and meant it, and would spend the next 4 months believing it with his whole chest, because the alternative, the version of the story where holding it down turned out to mean something other than what he thought it meant, was not a story he had the imagination, yet, to tell himself. The days at sea took on a rhythm that Michael had known for 12 years, and that still, somehow, never stopped feeling strange. The engine room's heat and roar for 8, 10, 12 hours at a stretch, the particular quality of exhaustion that came from work that used your whole body. Meals in the mess hall that tasted the same on every ship he'd ever worked. The narrow bunk that rocked him to sleep most nights and kept him awake on others when the swells got big enough to slam his shoulder against the wall. He called home twice a week when the satellite signal cooperated, which was not always. Sometimes the calls dropped mid-sentence, sometimes they didn't connect at all, and he'd lie in his bunk afterward doing the math on time zones and worrying about a 5-year-old's heart 8,000 miles away, which was, he had learned, a very particular kind of helplessness, one that didn't announce itself loudly, but sat in your chest like ballast, low and constant, for the entire length of a voyage. "He asked about you today," Sarah told him, on a call in the second week, her voice compressed and slightly delayed by the satellite connection. "He wanted to know if boats have telephones. I told him you were calling him on exactly that kind of telephone right now, and he looked at the phone like it had personally betrayed him for not being big enough to see boats through." Michael laughed, the first real laugh he'd had in days, and for a moment the ache in his chest eased. "Tell him I'll draw him a picture of the boat. I'll mail it when we hit port. He'd like that." A pause, staticky and long. "I miss you," Sarah said, and something in her voice made him want to ask what was wrong. But the call dropped before he could. And by the time it reconnected, the moment had passed and they were back to logistics, the surgery scheduling, the insurance paperwork, whether the gutter on the east side of the house needed fixing before the spring rains got worse. He didn't think much of it at the time. It would be months before he understood that the pause, and the particular way she'd said "I miss you," like a confession rather than a simple statement of fact, had been the first small crack in something that was already, quietly, coming apart 6,000 miles behind him. Back in Newport, Sarah's days had taken on a shape of their own, one that looked, from the outside, almost exactly like her days had always looked, and felt, from the inside, entirely different. She dropped Ethan at his kindergarten's before care at 7:40, drove to the Merrimack Insurance Group offices by 8:15, spent her days drafting marketing copy and sitting through meetings about quarterly campaign metrics, picked Ethan up by 5:30, made dinner, gave him his evening medications on the scheduled doctor. Guyon had them keeping, a beta blocker, a diuretic, a careful log of his weight and his color, and how many times he woke up at night, put him to bed, and then sat alone in a house that had, for the first time in her adult life, no other adult in it at all. It was the alone part that surprised her most. She had expected to miss Michael. She had missed him on every previous voyage, 3 months at a stretch since Ethan was 2, and she had a whole repertoire of ways to get through it. Extra shifts at work, long calls with Lisa, bad reality television with a glass of wine after Ethan was asleep. What she hadn't expected this time was how much larger the house felt, how the silence after Ethan's door clicked shut at 8 p.m. seemed to have a texture to it, almost a weight, settling over the empty rooms like dust. She hadn't expected either how much she would start looking forward to her conversations with David Coleman. David Coleman had joined Merrimack Insurance Group as creative director 8 months before Michael's first long voyage, transferred in from a larger firm in Boston that he described, with a self-deprecating half-smile that Sarah would later come to know very well, as a place that ate people alive, and called it Culture Fit. He was easy to like in the specific way that people who have practiced being easy to like are easy to like, quick with a joke in meetings, generous with credit, the kind of manager who remembered his coworkers' kids' names and asked about them, genuinely, not as small talk. Sarah's desk was 2 doors down from his office, and in the ordinary run of things they crossed paths the way colleagues do. Project check-ins, the shared coffee machine, the occasional after-work drink with the broader team on a Friday. It was unremarkable. It had been unremarkable for 8 months. What changed, in the weeks after Michael's ship pulled out of Providence Harbor, was not any single dramatic thing. It was smaller than that, and slower, and this was the part Sarah would spend a long time turning over afterward, trying to find the exact seam where it had gone from nothing to something. It hadn't felt, at the time, like it was changing into anything at all. It had felt like kindness. It had felt like exactly the kind of ordinary human attention that she was starving for and hadn't fully realized she was starving for. It started with him noticing she looked tired. Then it was him bringing her coffee, unprompted, the way she took it, because he'd apparently paid attention at some point without her noticing he was paying attention. Then it was him asking, one Tuesday afternoon with the office mostly empty, how Ethan's surgery planning was going, and really listening to the answer, not the polite 3-sentence version she gave people at the grocery store, but the whole thing, the fear underneath it, the exhaustion of doing this alone for months at a time. "That's an enormous amount to carry by yourself," he said, and there was nothing performative in the way he said it. "I don't know how you're doing it." "Neither do I, most days," Sarah admitted, and it was the first time in weeks she'd said something true out loud to another adult, and it felt like setting down a suitcase she hadn't realized she was still holding. They started getting lunch together, occasionally, then more than occasionally. It was innocent, she told herself that at every stage, and for a long while it even was true. David was divorced, no kids, a clean apartment near the waterfront that he mentioned in passing the way people mention facts about themselves, not as an invitation. He talked about his ex-wife sometimes, about how the marriage had ended less in a single explosion than in a long, slow leak, both of them realizing one day that they'd become polite strangers who shared a mortgage. Sarah found herself thinking about that phrase, polite strangers who shared a mortgage, more than she wanted to admit, turning it over at odd moments, wondering with a guilt she didn't examine too closely whether it described something she recognized. Because the truth she wasn't saying to anyone, not to Lisa, not to her own reflection in the bathroom mirror at 11 at night, was that she was lonely in a way that had nothing to do with Michael being a bad husband. Michael was not a bad husband. Michael was, by any reasonable measure, a remarkable one. He had signed himself up for a harder, more dangerous, more exhausting version of his job specifically so that their son could live, and he had done it without hesitation, without resentment, without once making her feel like a burden for needing it. She loved him. she would have told anyone who asked, with complete sincerity, that she loved her husband. But love, she was discovering, did not fill a house. Love did not sit across the table from you at dinner, or notice when you'd had a hard day, or ask a real question and wait for a real answer. Love, 3 months at a time, was a voice on a satellite phone that dropped calls in the middle of sentences, and a name she said to reassure a 5-year-old, and a photograph on the nightstand that she sometimes caught herself talking to, quietly, in the dark, the way you'd talk to someone who could no longer talk back. David Coleman talked back. That was the whole terrible, simple truth of it, and Sarah wouldn't let herself look at it directly for a long time yet. Wouldn't let herself name what was happening even as it was already, unmistakably, happening. The extra 10 minutes she spent on her hair before work. The way her stomach did something complicated when his name came up on her calendar for a project meeting. The small, guilty thrill of being seen, really seen, by someone who was there, in the room, in the flesh, while her husband was somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean fixing an engine so their son could have a heart that worked. The Ocean Voyager docked back in Providence on a bright July morning, and Michael came down the gangway with 4 months of beard growth and a duffel bag over one shoulder, and the particular lightheaded feeling of solid ground after 17 weeks of moving water. Sarah was waiting at the bottom with Ethan, who broke away from her hand and ran the last 20 feet, and Michael dropped his bag and caught his son and lifted him clean off the ground, spinning once, both of them laughing. "You got tall," Michael said into his son's hair. "You got tall and I missed it. I'm this many now," Ethan said, holding up 5 fingers and then, after a moment's calculation, a 6th, thumb tucked awkwardly against his palm. Almost 6, that's very old." Sarah stood a few feet back, watching them, and when Michael finally set Ethan down and turned to her, she stepped into his arms with something that felt, for one unguarded moment, exactly like relief. The specific relief of coming back to solid ground herself, of remembering what it felt like to be held by someone whose body she'd known for 8 years, whose smell and weight, and the particular way his arms closed around her, were as familiar as her own name. "Welcome home," she said into his shoulder, and for that moment, in the bright dockside light, everything that had shifted in the last 4 months seemed very far away, seemed almost like it might not be real at all. It was a good homecoming, on the surface. Michael had 3 weeks between contracts before the next voyage, and they spent them the way they'd always spent his time home, barbecues in the backyard, a trip to the beach at Narragansett where Ethan built increasingly elaborate sandcastles that Michael dutifully photographed for posterity, evenings on the porch after Ethan was asleep, a bottle of wine between them, catching up on months of small news the way people do who've been apart and are relearning the shape of each other's days. But there were things Sarah didn't say. She didn't mention David's name, not once, not even in the ordinary way she'd have mentioned any other colleague. A small, deliberate omission that she told herself was just about not boring Michael with office politics, and that she knew, somewhere underneath the telling, was something else entirely. And there were things Michael noticed without being able to name them, a distance in Sarah that hadn't been there before, small hesitations before she answered certain questions, the way she seemed, some evenings, to be somewhere else entirely even while she sat across the table from him. "You seem tired," he said one night, the two of them doing dishes together, an old domestic rhythm they fell back into easily. "I am tired," Sarah said, which was true, and answered nothing. "Is it just, all of it, the surgery stuff, doing everything alone while I'm gone?" "It's a lot, Michael." There was an edge in her voice that surprised them both. "It's a lot to hold by myself for months at a time. I don't think you understand how much it is." "I'm trying to," Michael said, and he meant it. And there was a version of this conversation that could have gone somewhere honest, somewhere that might have changed what came after. If Sarah had said, in that moment, "I've been so lonely I let myself get close to someone at work and I don't know what to do about it." If Michael had pressed harder instead of accepting the answer she gave him, which was a smaller, safer, half-true thing about exhaustion and logistics and the unfairness of the whole situation. Neither of those things happened. The moment passed, the dishes got finished, and 3 weeks later Michael shipped out again, and Sarah drove home from the docks with Ethan asleep in the back seat, and somewhere in the drive she found herself, without deciding to, thinking about David, about the lunch they had planned for Thursday, about the particular warmth of being looked at by someone whose eyes didn't have 4 months of ocean between the looking and the seeing. She hated herself a little for it. She would go on hating herself for it, in small private moments, for a long time, and she would go on doing it anyway, because loneliness, she was learning, was a much stronger argument than guilt, especially at 11 o'clock at night in an empty house, with a photograph on the nightstand that couldn't hold her back. It happened on a Thursday in September, 6 weeks into Michael's second long voyage, in David's apartment near the waterfront, where they had gone after a dinner that had started as a work debrief and had turned, somewhere over a second bottle of wine, into something else. Sarah would remember, afterward, How ordinary the evening had felt right up until it wasn't ordinary at all. How they had talked about nothing important, about a difficult client and a movie they'd both seen and Ethan's newest obsession with a cartoon about a talking bulldozer, and how David had made her laugh, really laugh, in a way that felt like it unlocked something in her chest that had been clenched shut for months. She would remember standing in his kitchen while he refilled her glass, and the specific moment their eyes met and held a beat too long, and the way neither of them looked away, and how she had known, in that exact instant, with total clarity, exactly what was about to happen, and exactly that she was not going to stop it. She didn't call it an affair, not at first, not even inside her own head. She called it a mistake, which felt like a smaller word, a word that implied something contained and singular rather than something that might repeat itself. But it did repeat itself, the following week, and the week after that, a rhythm establishing itself with the terrible ease of things that have found their groove. Lunches that became dinners that became evenings at his apartment while Ethan was at Lisa's for a sleepover. While Michael was 2 time zones and 8,000 miles away doing 12-hour shifts in an engine room to pay for their son's heart. The guilt was there. Sarah wanted to be honest with herself about that much. At least, the guilt was real, and it was constant. A low hum underneath everything. Present at the dinner table with Ethan. Present during her satellite calls with Michael. Present in the shower some mornings when she'd catch her own eyes in the fogged mirror and have to look away. She was not a person who had set out to become this. She had married Michael Reynolds because she loved him with an entirety that had felt, at 26, like the safest bet she'd ever make. She had not planned for a 5-year-old's failing heart to become the wedge that split that certainty open. But the guilt, it turned out, was not stronger than the loneliness, and it was not stronger than the specific addictive relief of being chosen, actively and presently, by someone who was there. David never asked her to leave Michael. He was careful about that, in fact. Careful in a way that Sarah would only much later recognize as its own kind of strategy. He let the relationship exist in a suspended, undefined space. Present tense only. No promises, no plans. Which made it easier for her to tell herself it wasn't really a betrayal so much as a survival mechanism. A thing she was doing to get through an impossible year. That it would end on its own once the crisis passed. She told herself a great many things, in that period. She told herself Michael would never know. She told herself it wasn't hurting anyone, since Ethan was too young to understand and Michael was too far away to feel the absence of something he didn't know to look for. She told herself, on her worst nights, that Michael had, in some sense, chosen the ocean over her. A thought she recognized even as she had it as a small, ugly piece of self-justification. A story she was telling to make her own choices easier to live with, and she told it to herself anyway, because it worked, because it let her sleep. Michael, 6,000 miles away, knew none of it. He called twice a week and heard a wife who sounded tired but present, who asked about the ship and the crew, and told him small funny stories about Ethan's kindergarten class, who said *I love you* at the end of every call in a voice that, to his ear, sounded exactly the way it always had. He had no reason to hear anything else in it. He was a man doing the hardest, most exhausting work of his life in service of a family he believed, with his whole unguarded heart, was waiting for him whole and intact on the other side of every voyage. By November, Ethan's condition had stabilized just enough, according to Dr. Nguyen, to schedule the surgery for the following March, giving them 4 more months to raise the remainder of the money, and giving Ethan's small overworked heart 4 more months to keep compensating for a defect it could not fix on its own. Michael had come home from his second long voyage with a bonus check that, combined with what they'd saved and a hardship loan from the credit union, put them within striking distance of the number Dr. Nguyen had quoted them back in March. 1 more sailing, Tom told him. 1 more 4-month run on the Pacific route, and they'd have it covered with room to spare. 1 more, Michael told Sarah, the 2 of them at the kitchen table with the finances spread out between them. A rare and welcome sight, a plan coming together, an end in sight to the arithmetic that had governed every decision they'd made for the better part of a year. 1 more, and then I go back to the shorter contracts. 3 months instead of 4. We'll figure out how to make the shorter money work once he's through the surgery. 1 more, Sarah repeated, and there was something in her voice that Michael, tired and relieved and focused on the finish line, didn't quite catch. Something that might have been guilt, or grief, or the complicated arithmetic of a woman who had by then been sleeping with another man for 2 months and had no earthly idea how to stop, or whether she even wanted to. Because that was the truth Sarah could not say out loud to anyone, not even to herself in her most honest moments. She did not know, anymore, what she wanted. She wanted Ethan's heart fixed. That was not in question, had never been in question, was the bedrock underneath everything else that had happened. She wanted Michael home, safe, the man she'd married. And she wanted, this was the part that frightened her, she wanted David too, wanted the specific, uncomplicated ease of him. The way being with him didn't come bundled with 4 months of absence and the particular grief of loving someone who lived, for a third of every year, somewhere she couldn't reach him. She had started, by November, to let herself imagine a version of her life without Michael in it, not because she'd stopped loving him, but because the imagining itself had become a kind of relief, a place her mind went when the guilt got too heavy to carry honestly. In that imagined life there was no ocean between her and the person she loved. In that imagined life dinner was a two-person conversation instead of a satellite call with a 2-second delay. In that imagined life, she was not lying, every single day, to a man who had given up more than half a year of his life at sea to save their son. She hated the imagining. She did it anyway, more and more, until it stopped feeling like a fantasy, and started feeling, quietly, and without her quite noticing the transition, like a plan. Michael shipped out for his third long voyage the week after Thanksgiving. The ocean voyager pulling away from the Providence docks under a sky the color of wet slate. And this time, when Sarah watched the ship shrink to nothing on the horizon, she did not feel the same clean grief she'd felt the first time. She felt something more complicated, relief tangled up with guilt, tangled up with a small, treacherous hope that 4 months of distance might make it easier to figure out what came next, might give her room to breathe and think without her husband's face across the table reminding her, every single day, of exactly what she stood to lose. She was wrong about that, as it turned out. Distance did not make anything clearer. It only gave the guilt more time to grow teeth. Lisa Whitfield had always been the sharper of the two sisters, more skeptical, less patient with self-delusion. The one who'd talked Sarah out of a bad tattoo at 22, and an even worse boyfriend at 24. She noticed things. And in the first week of December, picking Ethan up from Sarah's house for a sleepover, she noticed a man's jacket hung on the hook by the door that was not Michael's jacket, was in fact a jacket she recognized, with a small jolt of unwelcome understanding, from the office holiday party photos Sarah had posted online 2 Decembers running, a jacket that belonged to a colleague named David, whom Sarah had mentioned exactly once, in passing months ago, and had not mentioned since, which in retrospect struck Lisa as its own kind of tell. "Whose jacket?" Lisa asked, keeping her voice light, testing. "David's. From work. He dropped off some files," Sarah said, too fast, not looking up from where she was packing Ethan's overnight bag. And Lisa, who had watched her sister lie about a surprise party once and knew exactly what the lying looked like on her, filed the moment away and didn't say anything more that day, because Ethan was standing right there with his dinosaur backpack, and some conversations were not for 5-year-olds' ears. She brought it up 2 weeks later, over coffee, just the two of them, Ethan safely at kindergarten, and Michael safely at sea. "Sarah," she said, "I need you to tell me the truth about something, and I need you to actually tell me the truth, not the version you tell yourself." Sarah's hands went very still around her coffee cup. "What are you talking about?" "The jacket, David, whatever this is." Lisa kept her voice gentle, but she didn't look away. "You don't talk about him, and you used to talk about everyone at that office. That's not nothing. I know you, Sarah." The silence stretched long enough that it became its own answer. Sarah set down her cup, and when she finally spoke, her voice cracked in a way that surprised them both. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said. "I don't, Lisa. I love Michael. I do. But I am so tired and so alone, and this, David, it isn't supposed to mean anything. It was never supposed to become—" She stopped, pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "It's a mess. I know it's a mess. I don't know how to stop it, and some days I don't even know if I want to." Lisa didn't say what she wanted to say, which was several things, most of them not kind, about a husband working himself half to death on a container ship to save their son's life while his wife slept with a man from her office. She was Sarah's sister, not her judge. Or she was trying very hard to be that, in the moment, even though something in her had gone cold and disappointed in a way she knew wouldn't fully thaw for a long time. "You need to end it," Lisa said instead quietly. "Whatever this is. Before Michael comes home. Before Ethan's surgery. You need to end it, and you need to actually figure out, whether you want this marriage. Because right now you're not choosing anything, Sarah. You're just letting it happen to you, and that's not fair to Michael, and it's not fair to you either." Sarah nodded, tears finally spilling over, and said she would, said it with what felt, in the moment, like real conviction. She meant it when she said it. She would spend the next 3 months discovering that meaning a thing and doing it were very different exercises, and that David Coleman, when she finally tried to end it in January, did not make it easy, did not fight for her, exactly, but made himself so quietly, persistently present, so attentive at precisely the moment Sarah was most exhausted and most alone, that every attempt she made to walk away collapsed within a week, sometimes within days, back into the same familiar guilty rhythm. Michael's ship came back into Providence in the last week of March, 4 days before Ethan's scheduled surgery, and this homecoming had none of the leisurely warmth of the ones before it. It was fast, logistical, urgent, Everyone's attention pulled immediately toward Boston Children's Hospital and the surgical team, and the mountain of pre-op appointments that needed to happen in a 4-day window. Michael barely had time to unpack his duffel bag before they were driving up to Boston. Ethan quiet and a little pale in his booster seat, sensing, the way children sense things adults think they're shielding them from, that this was not an ordinary hospital visit. The night before the surgery, the three of them stayed in a hotel near the hospital, and Michael lay awake long after Sarah and Ethan had both fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, running through every version of every outcome the surgical team had walked them through. The good outcomes, the complications, the small flat statistic Dr. Nguyen had given them for the worst outcome of all. A number small enough to be reassuring and large enough to be the only number in the room. Some nights, when Michael let himself think about it directly, he looked over at Sarah, asleep beside him, and felt a wave of love so large it was almost frightening. Love for the woman who had held their whole world together for a year and a half of his absence, who had gotten up every day and gone to work and taken care of their son and kept the house running and never once, in any phone call, in any letter, let him hear how hard it actually was. He didn't know, lying there in the dark hotel room, that the woman beside him was carrying a second exhaustion he knew nothing about. The exhaustion of a secret, the specific weight of loving two men at once and hating herself for it. The guilt that had followed her up the elevator and into this bed the night before their son's open heart surgery. Sarah wasn't fully asleep. She lay very still, eyes closed, and thought about David. She hated herself for it. In that hotel bed, on that particular night, more than she had ever hated herself for anything, and she thought about him anyway. A small guilty flicker of a thought that she pushed away and that came back regardless. Because guilt, she had learned, did not obey a schedule, did not politely step aside on the nights that mattered most. The surgery took 6 hours. Michael and Sarah sat together in the surgical waiting room the entire time, not talking much, taking turns walking to the vending machines for coffee neither of them drank, and at some point, without either of them deciding to, they ended up holding hands, the way they used to, tight enough that Sarah's knuckles ached afterward. For those 6 hours, everything else fell away. David, the ocean, the arithmetic of the last 2 years, all of it collapsed down to a single point of focus, a single prayer repeated without words. Asterisk, let him be okay, let him be okay, let him be okay. When Dr. Nguyen finally came out, still in scrubs, and told them the repair had gone better than they'd hoped, the valve reconstructed, the septal defect closed properly this time, Ethan's heart, for the first time in his short life, structurally whole. Sarah burst into tears and Michael pulled her into his arms, and for one long unguarded moment they were simply a mother and a father whose son was going to live. Nothing more complicated than that, nothing else in the world mattering at all. It would be one of the last moments of unguarded closeness they would ever share. Ethan's recovery took 6 weeks, most of it at home in Newport, under a schedule of follow-up appointments, restricted activity, and a color returning to his cheeks that neither Michael nor Sarah had realized, until they saw it. They'd been missing for years. A pink, ordinary, healthy flush that made him look, for the first time either of them could remember, like an entirely unremarkable little boy, the kind who could run across a playground without anyone watching him with one eye for signs of trouble. Michael took the full 6 weeks off, unpaid, using savings that had been earmarked for the surgery and were now, blessedly, not needed for that purpose. It was the longest uninterrupted stretch of time he'd spent at home since Ethan was 3 years old, and he threw himself into it with the particular hunger of a man who had missed too much. Piano lessons Ethan didn't actually take but wanted to, badly, so Michael found a second-hand keyboard and taught himself 3 chords ahead of his son every week. A treehouse in the backyard, modest and slightly crooked, that the two of them built together over a series of Saturday afternoons. The ordinary daily rituals of breakfast and school pickup and bedtime stories that Michael had spent 2.5 years experiencing only through Sarah's second-hand descriptions on staticky phone calls. He noticed, in those 6 weeks, that something in Sarah had changed, though he couldn't put a precise name to it. She was present, attentive to Ethan, warm with Michael in the ordinary daily ways of a marriage, but there was a distance underneath it, a quality of watchfulness, as though she were narrating her own life to herself from a slight remove. He asked her about it once, gently, over dinner after Ethan was asleep. "You seem like you're somewhere else sometimes," he said, "even when you're right here." "I've just been tired for 2 years, Michael," Sarah said, and it wasn't a lie, exactly, though it also wasn't the truth, and Michael, exhausted himself, and enormously relieved about Ethan, and not particularly inclined to go looking for trouble in a season that finally, after so long, felt like relief, let it go. What he didn't know, what he would not know for another 3 weeks, was that Sarah had in fact ended things with David the week before Ethan's surgery. A real ending this time, tearful and final, the two of them agreeing in his apartment that whatever this had been, it was over, that Sarah owed her whole self to her family, now that the crisis that had, in some unspoken, uncomfortable way, enabled it was finally resolved. She had meant it. She had walked out of his apartment that day feeling, for the first time in months, something like clarity. And then Ethan had come through the surgery healthy, and Michael had come home for 6 uninterrupted weeks, radiating a kind of open, easy love that Sarah found herself, to her own surprise and distress, unable to fully receive, because something had shifted in her during those 2 years that she could not simply shift back. She loved Michael. She would have said so, and meant it, at any point during those 6 weeks. But she had also discovered, somewhere in the last year and a half, a version of herself who did not want to be married to a man who left for 4 months at a time, who did not want to spend a third of every year alone with a small child, and a growing loneliness that no amount of love, delivered long distance through a satellite phone, seemed able to fill. She did not know yet what she was going to do about that discovery. She only knew, watching Michael teach Ethan a chord progression on a second-hand keyboard on a Tuesday evening in May, that something had broken in her that this happy, ordinary scene could not put back together, and that the not knowing was its own kind of exhausting, its own kind of grief, arriving in the middle of what should have been the best season their family had had in years. Michael's 6 weeks ended in the middle of June, and with Ethan cleared for normal activity by Dr. Guyon and the family's finances still recovering from a year and a half of surgery costs, he made the decision to go back to work, not on the long Pacific contracts this time, since the emergency that had made them necessary no longer existed, but on a standard 3-month rotation, the kind he'd worked for years before Ethan's diagnosis worsened. It felt, to Michael, like a return to normal. A hard-won, well-earned normal, the kind of ordinary life he'd spent 2.5 years fighting to get his family back to. He shipped out in late June, and this departure felt different from all the others. Lighter. Almost. Because for the first time since Ethan's diagnosis, Michael left the dock without the low hum of dread that had accompanied every previous voyage. His son was healthy. His marriage, as far as he understood it, was intact. He stood at the rail as Newport shrank behind him and allowed himself, for the first time in years, to simply look forward to the money he'd earn and the family he'd come home to, without the shadow of a hospital bill or a failing heart hanging over the thought. He had no way of knowing that Sarah, back on the dock, had spent the drive home in near total silence, Ethan chattering in the back seat about nothing in particular, while she turned over a decision that had been forming, slowly and without her full permission, over the preceding 6 weeks, the decision that she could not keep living inside a marriage built around a third of every year spent alone. That the ending with David 3 months earlier had closed one door but had also, in its aftermath, opened her eyes to something about her own life she could no longer close them to. She called David in July. She told herself, dialing his number, that it was to ask how he was doing, an old friend kind of call, nothing more, and she believed that, for approximately the first 4 minutes of the conversation, before the old ease reasserted itself between them, the same warmth, the same feeling of being fully present to another person instead of loving someone at the far end of an ocean. They met for coffee the following week. The coffee became dinner within a month. By August, Sarah was back in the same place she'd sworn to Lisa, to herself, to David, and in some unspoken way to Michael, that she would never return to. This time, though, something in her had changed. This time, she did not spend her nights in guilty, private torment. This time, she let herself think, clearly and without flinching away from the thought, about what it would actually mean to leave, not as a fantasy, not as a coping mechanism for an unbearable season, but as an actual plan, with actual steps, that she began, quietly, to take. She opened a separate bank account in August. She started, in September, having long, careful conversations with a divorce attorney named Diane Foster, whose office was 2 towns over, far enough that no one from Newport would recognize her in the waiting room. She did not tell Michael any of this on their twice-weekly calls, which continued in their familiar rhythm, updates about Ethan, who was thriving, running and playing and doing all the ordinary things a healthy 6-year-old does, blessedly unaware that the ground beneath his family was already shifting, already coming apart in ways his father had no idea to look for. "I love you," Michael said, at the end of every call, the same as he always had. "I love you too," Sarah said back, and by September she had stopped examining too closely whether that was still entirely true, because the truth, when she let herself look at it directly, was more complicated than either of those 3 words could hold. She did love him, in the way you love someone you built a whole life with, someone who had sacrificed enormously and asked for nothing in return except the family he believed he was coming home to, and she was also, unmistakably, already gone. Michael's ship docked back in Providence at the end of September, 3 months to the day after he'd left, and this homecoming, unlike the last one, carried an undertone he could feel but not name from the moment he stepped off the gangway. Sarah was there with Ethan, and the hug she gave him was warm enough, the kiss ordinary enough, but there was something held back in it, some part of her that did not fully arrive in the embrace the way it always had before. And Michael, exhausted from the voyage, and happy simply to be standing on land with his family in front of him, told himself he was imagining it. He was not imagining it. Within 2 weeks of being home, he began to notice a series of small, specific things that individually could have been explained away, but that together formed a pattern he couldn't ignore forever. Sarah taking phone calls in the bathroom with the door closed and the water running, a new habit that hadn't existed before. An evening she came home 40 minutes later than her stated schedule, with an explanation about traffic that didn't quite track with the route from her office. A new guardedness with her phone, which she had never before treated as private, now angled away from him on the kitchen counter, face down, in a way that felt deliberate. He asked her about it directly on a Sunday evening in mid-October, the two of them alone in the kitchen after Ethan had gone to bed. "Is something going on, Sarah? You felt different since I got back. I need you to just tell me if something's wrong." Sarah stood very still at the sink, her back to him, and for a long moment she didn't answer. And in that silence Michael felt something in his chest go cold and heavy, a dread that had nothing to do with Ethan's heart for the first time in 2.5 years. A dread that was entirely, specifically about the two of them. "I've been seeing someone," Sarah said finally, still not turning around. "Since, it started while you were on the long contracts. It ended, and then it started again this summer. His name is David. He's someone I work with." Michael did not say anything for what felt, to both of them, like an extremely long time. When he finally spoke, his voice came out quieter than he expected, stripped of anger, at least in that first moment, and full instead of something closer to disbelief. "How long?" "On and off. About 1.5 years total. I ended it once, before Ethan's surgery. I meant it when I ended it." Sarah finally turned around, and her face was wet, and Michael found himself, in the middle of his own devastation, still automatically cataloging whether her tears were real, a reflex of a man who had spent 2.5 years learning to trust his wife completely, and was now discovering, in real time, that the trust had been misplaced. "I'm not going to pretend I have some story that makes this okay. I don't. I was lonely, and I made a choice, over and over, that I knew was wrong, and I kept making it anyway. While I was gone," Michael said, "working 4-month contracts. To pay for our son's surgery, you were..." He couldn't finish the sentence. He stood up from the table so abruptly the chair scraped hard against the floor, and Sarah flinched, and Michael grabbed his jacket off the hook by the door and walked out into the cold October night without another word. Because there was nothing in him, in that moment, capable of forming a sentence that wouldn't come out as something he couldn't take back, and some deep, exhausted part of him understood that he needed air, needed distance, needed anything other than the kitchen where the last 2.5 years of his life had just quietly, catastrophically come apart. Michael spent that first night, and the 2 weeks that followed, on Tom Alvarez's couch, a lumpy, ancient piece of furniture that Tom insisted had character, and that Michael found himself staring at the ceiling above night after night, running the same 2.5 years back through his memory, with a new painful lens. Every satellite call, every homecoming, every asterisk "I love you" asterisk at the end of every conversation. All of it now suspect, all of it recolored by the knowledge of what had actually been happening on the other end of the line. "You couldn't have known," Tom told him, more than once, sitting across from him with 2 beers neither of them was drinking with much enthusiasm. "You were doing the one thing you could do. There's no version of this where you stayed home and it doesn't get told to you eventually. Either the money doesn't come together and the kid doesn't get his surgery, or it does and this happens anyway. Because whatever was broken between you two, it wasn't the ocean that broke it. The ocean was just where you found out." Michael didn't fully believe him, not yet. He spent those 2 weeks moving through a fairly standard sequence of a betrayed man's grief, disbelief giving way to a rage so total it frightened him, rage giving way to a bottomless, humiliating grief, grief giving way, eventually, to something quieter and more exhausted, a kind of numb functionality that let him show up for Ethan, who did not yet know anything was wrong beyond "Mommy and Daddy need some time," a phrase Sarah and Michael had agreed on, one of the only things they'd managed to agree on in that first terrible fortnight. He saw Ethan every day, even while he was staying at Tom's, picked him up from school some afternoons, took him to the park, sat with him at the kitchen table doing homework while Sarah made herself scarce in another room, an arrangement that was awkward and painful and that both of them, to their credit, worked hard to keep from touching Ethan any more than it already had to. Ethan, for his part, seemed to sense that something had shifted, in the particular unspoken way children sense these things, but 6-year-olds have a limited capacity for sustained anxiety about things they cannot name, and mostly he seemed simply happy that both his parents kept showing up, which they did, scrupulously, even in the middle of the worst 2 weeks of their marriage's slow unraveling. Michael called his mother in Ohio during that second week, the first time he'd told anyone in his family, and cried on the phone in a way he hadn't done since he was a boy, and his mother, a widow who had raised 3 kids largely on her own after his father's early death, listened without interrupting and then said something that stayed with him. "You did everything right, Michael. Sometimes doing everything right isn't enough to keep something from breaking. That's not a reflection on you, it's just true, and it's the hardest kind of true there is." By the end of the second week, Michael had made a decision, one that felt less like a choice and more like the only remaining direction available to him. He was not going to try to save the marriage. Whatever had existed between him and Sarah, and he did believe, even then, even furious and grieving, that something real had existed, had been quietly dying for a year and a half while he was at sea trying to save their son's life. And he did not have it in him, did not believe it would be honest of him, to pretend that trust of that magnitude could simply be rebuilt because he loved his son and had once loved his wife. He called Robert Klein, a divorce attorney Tom's brother had used 2 years earlier, and made an appointment for the following Monday. The divorce proceedings took the better part of 8 months, dragging from November into the following July, longer and more grinding than either Michael or Sarah had anticipated when they'd first sat down, separately, with their respective attorneys. Robert Klein was blunt with Michael from their first meeting. Rhode Island's an equitable distribution state, he explained, sliding a legal pad across his desk with some preliminary notes already on it. That doesn't mean equal necessarily, but courts here tend to land close to a 50-50 split of marital assets in a marriage of this length, regardless of fault. Adultery can factor into things like alimony in some circumstances, but it's not a slam dunk, and Rhode Island judges generally don't punish infidelity in the property division the way people expect them to. She had an affair for a year and a half while I was working overtime to pay for our son's surgery, Michael said, his voice tight. That doesn't factor in? It can factor into the overall picture. A judge has discretion, and if we can show the affair created financial waste, gifts, hotel stays, that sort of thing, it can matter at the margins. But the house, the retirement accounts, what's left of the savings, the court is going to look at this as a partnership of 8 years where you both contributed, her through her income and running the household while you were away, you through your income at sea. It's not going to look at who cheated as the deciding factor for who gets what. I know that's not what you want to hear. It was not what Michael wanted to hear, and it took him weeks to arrive at a grudging, furious acceptance of it, the specific, bitter irony that the very sacrifice he'd made, the long absences that had created the loneliness Sarah pointed to as part of what had happened, could not be converted, in the eyes of the law, into some form of compensation for what she had done during those absences. Diane Foster, Sarah's attorney, made exactly the argument Klein had predicted, that the marriage's difficulties predated and extended beyond any single affair, that Sarah's contributions as the at-home parent during Ethan's medical crisis had value the court needed to recognize, that the house and the savings and the retirement accounts represented 8 years of joint effort regardless of how the marriage's final chapter had unfolded. The mediation sessions were some of the hardest hours of Michael's life, sitting across a conference table from Sarah, both of them formal and careful in a way that felt like a grotesque parody of the two people who had once built a treehouse together, once held hands in a surgical waiting room for 6 hours praying for the same outcome. In the end, the settlement split close to what Klein had predicted from the start. The house sold, with proceeds divided roughly in half after the mortgage was paid off. Retirement accounts split according to a formula both attorneys agreed on. The modest savings that remained after 2.5 years of medical bills divided the same way. Sarah did not seek alimony, a decision Michael would later learn had come from her own guilt more than any legal strategy, she told Diane Foster, in a private meeting Michael never heard about, that she didn't feel right asking for ongoing support from a man whose overtime had paid for her son's heart, whatever else had happened between them. Custody of Ethan was joint, close to equal, with a schedule built carefully around Michael's rotations at sea, 3 months on, 3 months off, an arrangement his attorney negotiated so that Ethan spent extended time with his father during Michael's stretches home and lived primarily with Sarah, with Lisa as backup support, during Michael's voyages. It was not a perfect arrangement. It was, both of them agreed, the best available answer to an impossible situation, and to their mutual credit, in the years that followed, they held to it without using Ethan as a weapon against each other, a small, hard-won grace in the wreckage of everything else. The final decree came through in July, almost exactly 2.5 years after the morning Sarah had told Michael, over cold coffee in the kitchen, that Dr. Nguyen's office wanted to move Ethan's appointment up. Michael signed the papers in Robert Klein's office on a Tuesday afternoon, walked out to his truck in the parking lot, and sat behind the wheel for a long time before he was able to make himself drive away, staring at a marriage certificate's mirror image, a decree of divorce, equally official, equally final, that reduced 8 years of a life he had built with his whole heart down to a stack of paper and a division of property that in the end had nothing at all to say about who had loved harder, or sacrificed more, or been wronged worse. It simply said, this is over, and this is what remains. 2 years after the divorce was finalized, Michael Reynolds stood at the rail of a different ship, a smaller one, this time, running shorter coastal contracts up and down the eastern seaboard. A deliberate choice he'd made once the settlement money and his adjusted expenses made it possible to trade the long Pacific hauls for something that let him be home most weeks, something built around a 50-50 custody schedule, and a son who was by then 8 years old and thoroughly, unremarkably healthy. A boy who played soccer on Saturdays and had strong opinions about dinosaurs that had, over the years, gradually evolved into strong opinions about sharks, and who ran the full length of a soccer field without anyone in the stands watching his color, his breath, the specific rhythm of a heart that no longer needed watching at all. Michael had rebuilt, slowly, in the 2 years since the decree, a smaller house on the west side of Newport, close enough to Sarah's that Ethan's transitions between them were a 15-minute drive rather than an ordeal. A quieter, more careful version of himself that Tom liked to say had finally learned to actually rest instead of just stopping. A low-grade joke that had more truth in it than either of them said out loud. He had dated, a little, tentatively in the second year, nothing serious yet, nothing he was in any hurry about, because he had learned, in the wreckage of his marriage, a certain patience about rebuilding things that he hadn't possessed before, an understanding that some structures needed to be laid slowly, board by board, the way he and Ethan had once built a crooked treehouse together, one Saturday afternoon at a time. His relationship with Sarah had settled, by then, into something neither warm nor bitter, a working co-parenthood built on the small daily logistics of a shared child. Birthday parties navigated with careful politeness, school events where they sat 2 seats apart and clapped for the same boy. Holidays split according to a schedule that had taken a full year to stop feeling like a wound and start feeling like simply how things were now. Sarah had married David 18 months after the divorce was finalized, a small ceremony Michael heard about secondhand, through Ethan, who mentioned it with the casual bluntness of an 8-year-old reporting a fact of no particular emotional weight to him, and Michael had felt something complicated hearing it, a grief that had mostly finished healing, giving one last quiet ache before settling back down. He thought, sometimes, standing at the rail of whatever ship he was on that season, about the 2.5 years that had upended his life. The diagnosis, the long voyages, the money he'd earned in an engine room 8,000 miles from his son's hospital bed, the marriage that had not survived what it took to save that same son's life. He did not think of it, anymore, as a story with a villain in it, not even on his angriest days, though there had been plenty of those in the beginning. He had come to understand it, slowly, the way a person comes to understand most of the hardest things in their life, not as a single betrayal with a single cause, but as a slow accumulation of loneliness and distance and human weakness, the kind that could happen to nearly anyone, given the right unbearable pressure and enough uninterrupted time alone with it. What he held on to, what made the whole impossible arithmetic of those years worth it in the end, was simpler than any of that. It was a photograph on his refrigerator, taken the previous summer, of Ethan grinning gap-toothed on a soccer field, sweaty and triumphant after scoring a goal. His cheeks flushed the ordinary healthy pink of a boy whose heart worked exactly the way a heart is supposed to work. It was Ethan's voice on the phone some evenings, rambling about sharks or homework, or a friend from school, utterly untroubled, utterly whole. It was the simple fact, underneath everything else that had been lost, that the sacrifice had done what it was meant to do, had bought, quite literally, a future for his son that would otherwise not have existed at all. Michael Reynolds had gone to sea to save his son's life, and it had cost him his marriage. And standing at the rail of a ship on a clear evening 2 years later, watching the coast of Rhode Island slide past in the gathering dark, he found that he could hold both of those truths at once without either one canceling the other out, the grief of what he'd lost, and the fierce, uncomplicated gratitude for what he'd kept. Some prices, he had come to understand, you pay without ever getting a discount for how much they hurt. You pay them anyway, because the alternative is unthinkable, and you find out afterward, standing at some rail on some evening years down the line, whether you can live inside the shape of what's left. He could. That in the end was the whole of what the sea had given him back.